All right, I want to talk about how you can pass your PhD with no corrections. I passed my PhD with no corrections. But just to let you guys know, um, passing your PhD with no correction does not mean you are, does not determine the level of your intelligence. Or if you have corrections to make in your PhD, either minor or major correction, does not mean you are not intelligent. It just has to do with the strategies you use in approaching your PhD. Like I said, I passed my PhD with no correction. And I'm going to let you know, I'm going to tell you guys the strategies I used that led to such result. When I began my PhD, I remember the first question my supervisor asked me was if I wanted to go um, on PhD by papers route or the normal traditional way of doing your PhD, which is to write your thesis chapter by chapter, and you don't need to publish your chapters before your viva. You can publish them after the viva. But with the PhD by papers, you have to publish at least two of your chapters, or three, two to three, before your viva. So those are the differences. So he asked me if I wanted to go on PhD by papers, or I want to go through the normal traditional route. So I opted for the PhD by papers. I don't understood the risk involved, but I went for that. So those are the two routes I that the two options I had. The first option was to go through the normal traditional PhD where you have to write chapter by chapter. And the second option was to publish my analytical chapters and at the end of the day summarize everything and it becomes a thesis. So I look at the pros and cons of both options, and I opted for the second option, which was to publish my chapters and at the end of the day summarize my the chapters and into my thesis. Mind you, the option I went for was a difficult option because the time you're going to spend, in reviewing your papers, going back and forth. If you have published papers before, you understand what I'm saying. The time for review could extend your PhD. That is the risk. It's very risky, and you might not be able to publish your papers. My analytical chapter 5 that I submitted for journal for consideration over 1 year ago, almost 13 to 14 months ago, just came back with major revision. So I have to revise the paper again and send it over to the journal. And it's still with the journal. As I'm talking to you now, it's still with the journal. It's still under review. So you can see going by publication is very, very risky, and I actually took the risk. Sometimes the risk can pay off, and sometimes it can delay your PhD. So those are the risks involved in doing your PhD by papers. Another thing you need to bear in mind if you want to pass your PhD with no correction is to pay very keen attention to what your supervisors are saying. Pay attention to whatever comments they make with respect to your work. It's very, very important. You need to address every comment, and you need very strong emotional intelligence to absorb whatever criticism or whatever comments you get from a supervisor, because some of the comments might sometimes make you angry, but don't get angry. They just want you to succeed, and they want you to learn as well. So that is another thing you need to consider, because PhD, in order to succeed in PhD, you need constant validation. And if you don't follow up your supervisor's comments, you are not getting that validation on time. That will slow down your PhD, and you will not be able to pass your PhD with no correction. So what I did in my case, I published my analytical chapters. I published 2 of my chapters, and the third was already under review as at the time of my viva. So when I submitted my thesis for viva, chapter 3, which was the first analytical chapter, was already published in one of the high impact journal. So published in Anthropocene journal. Chapter 4 was already published in Energy Research and Social Science, one of the high impact journal. So chapter 5 was already under review in Clean Technologies and Policy Journal. So when my examiners, when they looked at my work, the only area they concentrated on, they could concentrate on, was chapter 2. That's chapter 1, which is the introduction. Chapter 2, which summarized my methodology, and chapter 6, which was the synthesis of the whole thesis. So these were the only areas they could focus on if they wanted to change anything in my thesis, because obviously they couldn't change anything on chapter 3, 4, and 5, because chapter 3, 4 were already published in high reputable journals, and chapter 5 was already under review. So it would be foolish for anybody to change anything that has been published, because it has gone through peer review. They couldn't change anything in those chapters. So they just read the chapters, and they couldn't change anything in those chapters. Then chapter 1 and 2, which I was a little bit scared of, according to the report I got from them, chapter 2 was one of the best chapters. They loved that chapter, and the chapter 6 also was very good. So they could not really change anything in thesis because of the approach I took in my PhD, which was to go for the PhD by publication, PhD by papers. They could not change anything I've published, and the chapter they could have altered was chapter 2 and 6, and they said those chapters were lovely. They couldn't change anything in the chapters, and I submitted my thesis with no corrections. That was how I passed my PhD, with no corrections. It wasn't my sole effort. Your supervisor, you need to pay close attention to what your supervisors are saying in order to get such result. You need to really follow up your supervisors, and you need constant validation. You need constant validation. Let them validate your work. That will, bring progress to your work. And if you want to get no correction or minor correction in your PhD, you need to go for the option that I took, which was PhD by papers. It's a difficult route to take. It's risky because you have to go back and forth, during your paper during review, during peer review, you have to go back and forth. It's very, very challenging and time consuming. You might not be able to finish your PhD within the stipulated time. So those are some of the things you need to consider. But I took the risk. It was very risky, but I took the risk and I opted for that option, and it paid off. That was how I was able to pass my PhD with no correction. So the strategy is to go for PhD by papers. Publish your analytical chapters, because once it's published in reputable journals, or not even any journal, once it's published, it's gone through peer review, your examiners will not be able to change anything in those chapters. And that was exactly what happened in my case. Because I've already published those chapters, and the last chapter, analytical chapter, was under review, they could not change anything in those chapters because it has already gone through peer review. So that's one of the secret. That's one of the secret of passing your PhD with no correction. My PhD, my thesis was very, very was very interesting. I worked on global gas flaring, a multi-scale assessment of global gas flaring. That was what I worked on. It was very, very interesting, and they really loved my thesis, and they loved the subject area, and because they were very, very interested. And another thing you need to pay attention to when selecting your examiners, they have to be people that are interested in your field. They have to be people that are in your field, because the examiners I chose that we selected were into my field. They were really into my field, and they understood everything about my field. So they loved my thesis, because it was one of the areas they were actually looking at, researching on. So that's another secret. You have to pick people that are really in your field. And secondly, you have to, if you want to really pass a PhD very well, pass a PhD with no correction, you have to go for the option of doing your PhD by papers. That is going to, that will lead to, passing your PhD with no corrections. Like I said from the beginning, passing your PhD with no correction doesn't mean you are the most intelligent person on earth. No. It just depends on the strategy you used in approaching your PhD. That will determine if you are getting PhD, if you are passing your PhD with no correction, or minor correction, or major correction. I think, and I'm sure it will also help anybody planning to do a PhD. Thank you.